Hey guys, this is Kat, and today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on ZBrush that shows how to use a feature called ZSpheres to create supports for 3D printing. So I have this simple earring here that I've created in ZBrush. It's made up of 3 subtools that I've condensed down into one subtool, and then I'm going back in and adding these supports. You'll notice I have a couple different types, but I've got a straight support and I have an angled support. And in some cases, I'll even make other angled supports to support things like, for example, a sprue. So this is a similar layout, but I've added the sprue within ZBrush as well. And then here's the extra supports. So it's a very flexible program, and this feature makes it pretty easy. It might take you a little bit in the beginning, but I think that the end results for me as a jeweler to be able to have minimal cleanup and have really smooth results, I'm all about putting that work in on the front end and not having to do cleanup at the end. So again, I'm using ZBrush. I am using, if anybody's curious, I'm using the 64-bit version on an iMac 27-inch, so it is on a Mac. And I'm using a Formlabs printer, the Form 2, with the preform software that comes with it, and the castable version 2 resin, although this technique has worked just fine in regular resin as well. So with that, let's get started. Let's talk about the project. So I've started out with this earring, and usually when you're designing, it's going to be on a flat plane. So when I'm done, I've got this earring, and then I go back in and I add the supports. The very first step, though, is to put this at an angle. One thing I know from experience with my Form 2 is that if I print something like this, it tends to diminish the detail on the top. So it really does prefer being at an angle. And I'm looking at this by also rotating and using the Shift key to look directly at an angle. But in order to print this well, I need to rotate. So if I scroll down to the deformation palette, you'll see that I can choose rotate, and I want to rotate on the Z axis. So I click and I drag this, and usually about 40 to 45 degrees is a good angle. Now, some people get really aggressive with this because they might say, well, if I print it, let's say like 73 degrees, then it doesn't take as long because I have fewer layers. And I go for a balance somewhere between, between what I want, which is a 0 print time print, and something that's going to work better. So I go for about a 45-degree angle. So this is what it's going to look like. And I'm using the Shift key to snap to different views. You can look at the top if you want, but it's going to be really important to use that Shift key when you're changing view on this to get these straight. The best strategy that I've seen in making these supports is to go ahead and create a set of subtools that you can save in a folder. So for example, if I go up to the tool palette and choose Load Tool, you can see that I have a folder called Supports where I have a straight support, a double point support, and angled support. So once you've created these supports, it makes sense to save them so they can be reused for your projects later. So I hate redoing work. I think first of all, let's just go ahead and make the supports. So instead of appending a subtool, I'm not adding to this one, I'm going to go out to Simple Brush, or I could even just click on ZSphere over here. Start by creating a new document, not saving. Go to Simple Brush, choose it, and let's choose ZSphere. Or there's the quick pick at the top. So click and drag, and I can see that I have a sphere on the screen, but what size is it? Size is kind of a mystery with ZBrush sometimes. But if I go to the geometry menu, it'll tell me that it's a size 1. If I choose the size option, it's a size 1. But what does that mean in real life? Because I really need this sphere, I need this support to be somewhere between maybe 1.5 and 2 millimeters thick. I can go a little bit less. I have made them as low as maybe 1 millimeter to 1.25 millimeters, but I'm comfortable with about 1.5 to 2. So in order to increase this size, you need to go into the edit mode. So you can choose edit. And then let's see if I can change this to 2 by just clicking and hitting enter. And it doesn't do anything. So I'm just going to undo Let's scroll down to the deformation menu, and there's another size option here. And if I move this, let's see, I'm going to increase it by 0.5, and that didn't do anything. So let's try and drag it over, and there it goes. So 0.5 was not good. So let's say 50%. Let's go 50% higher and see what happens. All right, now we need to actually check the size of this. But if you've been using ZBrush, you'll notice if you choose the Move tool to go get a transpose bar that will let you measure it, it doesn't happen. The trick with ZSpheres is you press the A key, and that will convert it into a mesh that you can then measure. And we're more concerned about the mesh that's going to result. So let's take the Move tool, click on that corner, hold the Shift key, and it'll snap to these points. And it shows me that this is 1.826 millimeters. That's perfect. If it was a little bit small or a little bit too large, what you could do is press the A key to go back to the sphere. You could increase it a little bit, press A again, and then just measure it one more time. I usually get the bar out of the way and go for the snapping. And that shows me I have 1.932. Again, I'm going to size mine down just a tad because I do prefer them a little smaller. Hit A again, move that out of the way, click to grab the snapping effect, and I have 1.82. That's perfect. That'll work just fine. Now go back to the A, and now we are ready to start drawing. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I have more of a view. I'm also switching to the draw pointer. And if you're not familiar with using these in ZBrush, at the top, you switch to the draw mode by pressing T. I'm sorry, to edit, and then draw is Q, move is W. So it's basically the keys on the top row of your keyboard, so you can switch back and forth. So if I want to draw, I can press Q. Now I need to draw another sphere. So I'm going to click on the sphere, click and drag, and watch what happens when you hold the Shift key. It makes another sphere the same size as the original. Now you simply switch to the Move tool or press W, move that down and make it straight. Now you want to click out here to the side, click and drag and hold the Shift key. Now we need to move this Z-sphere so it's lined up. And so this is going straight up and down. And I can zoom out a little bit. At this point, I need this to be a lot longer. So I can then go to the Geometry palette and take a look at the Y size. It's 3.9. I'm going to change this to 35. I'm going to make this a really long support because I can always cut it off if I want. It's easier to cut them off than it is to, go in and try and stretch it because you have to mess with masking. You can also move this if you think it's not quite lined up. Let's see. So you can move it and then switch to the other side and make sure everything's straight, and that looks pretty good. All right, so now we have our Z-sphere rod that we have to go in and modify. I'll go ahead and press A to check and see if I can see the width of it, and it did some distortion, so we're not going to do that right now. It was just a test to see what it does. Now go to the draw menu, or the draw option again, and go to the top. Let's see. There we go. And I need to draw another little tiny ball up there. Okay, another Z-sphere. So click and drag. And now you can grab this little tiny ball at the top. You need to be in the move mode to do this. But you want to line that up so it's directly over the center axis. Click and drag, but use your Shift key and move this over again. And so if you're aligning it from two different axes, then it should be perfect. We can also move this down a little bit because I'm going to make this more of a little short stubby point. And then use the scale function to shrink this. So click on the ball and drag like that. And we're going to make this a little tiny point. Now I can zoom out and take a look, make sure everything looks all right. It does. And at this point, we need to turn this into a poly mesh or some sort of a mesh that we can use. Press the A to get a preview of what it looks like, and that looks pretty good. But at this point, we want to do one more step before we create our Polymesh Z tool that we're going to use later on. So zoom in, and we want to choose down here on the right-hand side, there's a button that says Line Fill Poly F, and that's Draw Polyframe. You can also use a Shift F. When you do that, you can see the grid that's behind, or you can see the mesh that's behind your model, and you can also see something called polygroups. So this yellow area down here is part of a group. In fact, if I want to isolate this, I can actually select that and get rid of a part, or click it again and isolate the point. But polygroups allow us to do some interesting things within ZBrush. So we want to zoom in with Polyframes turned on, and I need to get some measurements. I need to find out how big is the tip of a pencil, of our little pencil we're working with. So I get the Move tool, and I'm clicking on one side, holding the Shift key and finding the other side. I could zoom in even more if I want. So move this over by grabbing this blue line if I need to and go a little bit wider. And you can see that this particular width right here is 0.2849 millimeters. And that's actually still less than preform, but I could go a little bit smaller. So I'm going to move this up a little bit and see how wide is this next line. And I'm using these lines because it's just an easier way to do it. 0.24 millimeter, that's perfect. So I need to isolate this tip, and I need to create a polygroup. Now, if you hold the Command key, you can see that it'll show you your masking brushes. So hold Command, and the default is this rectangle. So change to rectangle, click and drag and isolate all of those different lines, including the blue line. So you'll see that this is darker up here. This one's kind of gray. But now if I do a Command W, but you'll see that I've now isolated the tip of this, and I know that the width of this tip right here is 0.24 millimeters. That's going to be the width of my supports, and that's what I'm going for. So if I zoom out, I now have a cute little 3D pencil that I can use. So the last step in this is to create a Polymesh 3D. At this point, if I press A, I can still go back to this to the Polyspheres, but I need to make this a mesh that I can duplicate and that I can do some other operations with. So go back to A, scroll to the top and choose Make Polymesh 3D. And one thing that I noticed up here when I did that is that I don't see, I've actually lost my little 3D tip here. So anyway, I can go back and define it if I lose it. It was this one right here. All I have to do is draw another box around it and then do a W, and there it is again. So you can do it before you create the Polymesh 3D, but if it doesn't work or if you lose it, you can just go back and do it again. And blue's pretty good. If you don't like blue, you can undo and then do a Command W again. Just keep doing Command W and then undo until you get a good color that has a lot of contrast. This will make your life easier. All right, so now this is a Polymesh 3D sphere is what it's showing. If we choose that, we can now rename it, and I'm going to call this my straight support polygroup. So that tells me that this one actually has the color coding on it. All right, so now what? Now we need to make a couple more supports. So for this, I'm going to go back to the ZSphere version up here. Not straight support, but ZSphere. When I go back to that, you didn't see any change, but if I press A, it gets me back to the Polyspheres. So what that means is I could then modify this one, maybe bend it, and make a new support. Then that's kind of an easy way to do it. I know the width on this is already a good width. The point is a good point. Oops, don't want to do that. I want to move this one. So I'm just going to take this one and make a quick little angle to it. You can press A again and see that all of a sudden you have a new support that's angled. And in this case, let's go ahead and just create a Polymesh 3D. And let's rename this one. So we're going to rename this one Angled Support. Add PG because it's going to have poly groups added. And now choose Line Fill Polyframe. So we're going to do the same thing that we did. Last time we did it before, we created the Polymesh 3D. But this time we're going to go up again, same exact thing, and we want to measure. So go to the Move tool, and let's measure across. And let's see about what we've got here. And this one you're just kind of eyeballing it a little bit, but it says 0.2766. And you know what? That's actually pretty good. So if we mark that, we know that we could have this even sticking out just a little bit. In fact, if we measured this line here, see what we got. This one says that it's 0.243. So that would be our bare minimum. Let's go ahead and we'll mark this one. So press down the Command key and then choose the mask lasso because we need to go a little bit at an angle here. You could also use the mask curve is another way to do this. In fact, let's just try that one here. So if you draw a line with the mask curve, you want it to be on the gray. The gradation side is going to be towards the tip, and let it go. And now you can just do a Command W, and sure enough, there is there's the tip of that marked at 0.43. That looks good. So now let's go ahead and turn off the polyframe, and there's your angled support. So let's do one last one. We're going to go back to the ZSphere version of this. Press A, and you can see again, we've got our angled support. Let's remove this polysphere at the end. You have to be in the draw mode for this to work, but press Option and click the polysphere and you're back to where you started. So we still have a 35 millimeter post, but it has no tip at the end. If you go to the Transform menu and choose Activate Symmetry, and it may be, I believe it's the X symmetry, and it is not letting me move. I guess I have to be in the Move version. Anyway, there we go. But let's turn on Transform, Activate Symmetry. And you can see it's got a little ball that's actually on the back of it. But let's go Draw, and let's see what happens. So you can see that there is one over here on the other side. I could make a comment about Madonna, but we won't. Anyway, so you could change to the Move tool and pull this out. You could then rotate and, of course, snap to the top and pull that out. But anything you do on one side will be reflected on the other. You can scale this one down to something nice and tiny that we like. And then press A, and you can see now we have a mesh that we can use. There is one more step to that, though, and you guessed it. We have to go in and draw our little pencil tips. So just go in on one side. It's going to mark both at the same time. Go to the Move tool. Let's find a side. Okay, and it is trying to snap on that. And it shows me that that's 0.16 millimeters. That's 21969. I'm going to go a little bit bigger there. There's a 0.26, so I feel pretty good with that. Now this one, I might have a hard time with the curve, so I'll press the Command key, and let's use the mask lasso. And hold down the Command key, and you're just going to draw between those two lines, and then make a big loop around it on the tip. Command W turns that into a nice bright green tip, and you'll see it did it to both. At this point, we're ready to do the next step, which is make it a Polymesh 3D. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and rename. So go find Rename, and let's call this Double Point Support PG for Polygroup. And my preference on this one with the greens, I wish they were just a little bit different color. We could change that. There's ways, but it's not really necessary. All right, so we have now successfully created 3 supports. So the next step before you do anything is go ahead and save as, and we'll just go ahead and Oh, there it is, double point. I'll just rename. We'll make these the same as the old ones. I'll replace it. Okay. Then switch to the angled support. Do a save as. Let's see. Save it. And then the last one would be the straight support. Save as. Replace. All right, so now we have our 3 supports that we can use for other projects. So click on to see the next video and you can see them in action.